let me set up some of the things that I've been thinking about. If you have run across this book, this will be familiar to you. But I want to set up a question about why it matters to think about content moderation as a sort of problem that platforms face and that society faces. And then I want to suggest that we've been thinking about content moderation in too limited a way, and I want to open up the conversation a bit. So I first need to set up sort of how we've been thinking about it, and then I want to challenge that a bit. So my talk today raises questions about content moderation as a kind of social problem, not just for the industry, but for society at large. And it's a topic I've been thinking about for the last decade or so. And clearly the public and the press and policymakers are thinking about it more and more, certainly over the last 5 years. My goal is not to weigh in on what rules social media platforms should or should not set, what right they have to do so, how they could be better at finding the content that they think violates those rules, when they're doing it right or when they're doing it wrong. That's a fun debate to have. The press has it all the time. It's an important set of questions. But I think as scholars of information systems, communication, media, and technology, there are bigger questions that we can ask that thinking about content moderation and the struggles we're having now is a way to open up those bigger questions. I think we can look into the debates about content moderation as a way to ask how platforms work, not just how they function, but how they, what position in society they have come to take. So how information intermediaries, if we want to get away from social media a little bit, how they enact and shift contentious cultural norms through both their design and their policies. When they engage in content moderation, how that affects users and content creators, how that affects the workers who do moderation, and how it shapes publics and information institutions. How platforms justify their intervention and at the same time perform their seeming non-intervention. So how do they present themselves as neutral and also explain why it is they go in and they delete certain content and not others? And then how in the process are they negotiating some really old tensions about media, right? Tensions that have plagued Western media for a long time. What it means to both shape what people want and give publics what they need. That's one tension. How to serve a public aim while also earning private profit. That's another one. And these are questions that have animated my field for quite a long time. And social media, while they would love to present themselves as being unlike traditional media, I think they find themselves in a similar position and are struggling with the same kinds of tensions and decisions, but maybe doing them in a different scale and in different ways. So my focus, my fascination is with social media companies, largely US companies, and the biggest ones. But these are questions that should pervade how we think about other kinds of platforms, how we think about other information intermediaries. That could be online marketplaces, that could be app stores, that could be collaborative projects, any place where some information service is facilitating the participation and circulation of cultural work. These are data systems. I feel like I have to tie it to the title of this series, the Data and Us series. These are, of course, data systems, and the approach that platforms take to moderation is a data-centric one. Many of the things they struggle with are about the places where a data-centric approach is in tension with, I don't want to make an opposite, a human-centered approach, a subjective human judgment approach. Problems that seem like they need to be solved at a data scale, but are not amenable to data solutions. So we could take the lessons of content moderation. If you happen to care about information systems that are not social media, you care about finance systems or government systems or medical systems, there are still questions about what it means to take on the role and responsibility of curating information that you didn't produce and are earning some value off of, right? And how do you make those decisions in the interest of whom and under what conditions? So I think there can be lessons, even if social media is not your particular fascination. We spend a lot of time thinking about the choices that major platforms make. Certainly the American press has, I gather the European press as well, and European policymakers are thinking a great deal about how to make sure that Facebook or Twitter or YouTube are moderating in a way that is both sort of fair and accountable, but also are answering thorny social problems like hate speech and harassment and terrorism. And so the debates that we're having now, which will settle somehow, right? We probably don't know that yet, are setting the terms for how it is that we expect information intermediaries to provide information, organize information, amplify information, how the decisions they make to manage a corpus of data, whether that's content or something else, belongs in some ways in their hands, in some ways in the public's hands, in some ways in the state's hands, and how their decisions are in some ways decisions about forming new information landscapes. So information environments that work differently because of the provision and moderation of information done by large-scale providers. In the Q&A, I'd be happy to do any of the following. One is dig more into the traditional questions about content moderation that have been animating academics and the press for a long time. Talk about European perspectives, and I might need you to tell me more about them because I hear them secondhand, or linking these questions to systems that aren't social media, but are happening in other contexts. I was going to put all that on the screen, so let me just do that for a second. I forgot how to do slides in this new world. Okay, so over the last decade, content moderation as a problem, a platform problem and a societal problem, has earned a great deal of public and policy attention. It's being debated in major newspapers and on the floors of governing bodies like US Congress and the EU, the UK, and this is a good thing. So I think in the last 10 years, social media companies have taken what they like to call trust and safety, which is their process of engaging in moderation. They've taken trust and safety more seriously. The tools they use to detect pornography, harassment, hate speech have become more sophisticated. And thankfully, more attention is being paid to the labor that it involves, the human labor in particular. At the same time, the thorny problems that seem to plague public social media have grown thornier. The techniques of harassers and propagandists and hate groups have become more developed, more sophisticated. And at least in the US, you can tell me about where you are, content moderation itself has become politicized. So the fights about what to do about content moderation have become a battle between left and right parties in the US. But also, and this is kind of what I want to pay attention to today, also what counts as content moderation and what earns the majority of all this attention from the press and from policymakers is solidifying in a way that I worry about. So we, and I mean academics as well, but certainly the press and concerned activists and policymakers, tend to pay attention to very high profile cases. We tend to pay attention mostly to the largest platforms. We tend to be drawn by the latest controversies and kind of the speed of the news cycle. And I think that this pull shapes our attention to the problem itself. So we think about content moderation through the lens of what did Twitter do now? Who did Facebook remove? what problems are plaguing YouTube that people are concerned about right now, and that's drawing our attention in very particular ways. Inside of the platforms, the people who do trust and safety work, who do content moderation, are professionalizing in certain ways, which is probably a good thing in general. But what it does, I think, is it kind of affirms and holds still certain ideas about how moderation should work, certain perceptions of what it's for, and certain approaches, certain techniques. And this is a specific point, I think, for the researchers in the room. Silicon Valley companies have turned to our fields for solutions. And maybe that's also a good thing in principle, but it may have the effect of turning social and technical researchers into problem solvers, into people who are supposed to put out fires for these companies, literally hiring them away. And I get the irony of me saying that working at Microsoft. I say this because I think there are bigger questions to be asked about the power of platforms. But if we focus entirely on the kind of the attention bubble about content moderation, these high profile cases, the actions of 4 or 5 platforms, we may obscure aspects of that power and aspects of that power that we would do well to scrutinize. Now, these are complex organizations. They're doing many overlapping things. I don't want to pretend that the clarity that we're supposed to have about content moderation should be reflected in that, right? These are big organizations doing a lot of things. I was struck by an article in 2019 that was talking about Facebook's efforts to do better about things like Myanmar, right? Being aware of racially motivated threats of violence that in that case led to genocide, being able to spot those things. And this article, this is 2019, was talking about how Facebook was getting serious about this problem. They were forming this strategic response team that was going to handle this better. And there was this one line in the article that said the new team began after Facebook employees realized last year that there were 30 internal teams that had a hand in the company's Myanmar response, though no one was in charge. And the article sets that up as like, look at Facebook not handling this problem right, scattering the problem across all these divisions. And that's true. It's a reasonable criticism. But I took something different, which is to say that content moderation as a problem, right? What do you do if your platform seems to host threats of violence that have the potential to become something quite damaging? That's more than just what the trust and safety team does, right? It happens in a lot of different dimensions of how Facebook or another platform are designed and how they respond to legal concerns and how they respond to activists and where they can intervene to adjust where this content is, who it's getting to, whether it should come down. And it's a reminder that there is a lot of discursive work, right? So this article in some ways was spun by Facebook saying, hey, we're doing a good job now, right? We're on top of this and we have a plan and we have a team that's dedicated. There's a lot of discursive work going on, a lot of the work done in how to describe the problem, how to describe the platform's efforts that are designed to kind of clarify and polish what counts as content moderation so that it seems like a clear, definable, effective, defensible part of what Facebook does or what another platform does. And I think of this as the power to define the problem, right? Defining both the category of content moderation and defining things that we might, from a step back, say, this looks like moderation to me, defining it as something else, right? And at least in the US, there's a real value for the companies that can do that, because anything that counts as content moderation now gets caught up in very heightened, very politicized debates about speech rights and the First Amendment and bias. And it's very difficult for the platforms to act in that space, right? Because any act they take or don't take can look wrong to the wrong side of the political debate. Other things that are treated as not content moderation, but might still be decisions about what kind of harmful content shouldn't get to people's eyes, if they're defined away as being something else, they sometimes avoid that. And they also avoid scrutiny. So if you are coming from the left and saying, we want platforms to moderate, but we want them to be accountable and transparent, the kinds of things that are then defined as not moderation fall away from that expectation. So let me highlight one kind of separation of something that is seen as not content moderation, but I would like to highlight that it is. I want to think about two elements of what platforms do, one being moderation and the other being recommendation. When we think about content moderation, the tendency is to focus on removal. So posts that are deleted, photos that are taken down, users that are suspended or banned. It's not surprising, certainly for press coverage, for critics, and for policymakers to be most concerned about that, right? It feels closest to censorship, right? Someone who was speaking is no longer on the platform. Some content that was published is now unpublished. So it's not surprising that we talk about removal all the time. I want to suggest that we need to think about other tactics that these platforms use that are not like removal and sort of come up in different ways. So let me think about the way that moderation and recommendation get treated as distinct. So there are a couple ways. So you might even think about them conceptually as opposed, right? So if moderation is generally about what are you not going to show, then recommendation is what are you emphasizing? What are you trying to show, right? Some things are selected out of the corpus and some things are selected for, right? Are highlighted, chosen, ranked highly, distributed. And I think when we think of those as two separate practices, a distinction that platforms make all the time, that policymakers make all the time, that get treated as having different expertise, they get mapped to different parts of the company, so different teams are actually doing the work, and that they think of users in different ways, and they think of the problems in different ways. So when we think about content moderation, we're often talking about harms, right? Harms that can be addressed. When we're thinking about recommendation, we are thinking about what's going to draw attention, what's going to enjoy engagement, what's of most value. Each has a different kind of technical challenge. So for content moderation, it's about detection. Here's this huge corpus. Inside of it are things that we want to remove. How do we find them automatically? For recommendation, it's about how do we personalize? What do we know about you? How do we give you the things you'd most like to see? Until recently, in most of these companies, the work of recommendation, the design of those tools was quite central to how the companies saw themselves, understood their value, how much access they had to senior leadership, how much influence they had in terms of making big decisions. Until recently, the trust and safety people were quite peripheral. So they existed, but they often didn't have good access to the senior leadership. They were not seen as bringing in much revenue. They don't bring in revenue. And so they were often shortchanged. That I think is changing, which is why I put the asterisk. I think as public concern has grown, those groups have grown in prominence. The senior leaders of these companies think about them more. And then critics have different concerns. So the critics of content moderation think a lot about speech issues. Who has the right to speak? How do we deal with harm? What are the costs and benefits of removal? And when we worry about recommendation, we tend to worry about something different, which is something like fairness and bias, right? Does the recommendation system privilege certain kinds of things over others, privilege certain kinds of users over others? Do the biases embedded in the data that it was trained on extend out into the tool? This distinction, this kind of pulling them away, and I think when we look at the law, the legal efforts in the EU and the US are also treating them as separate problems, makes me think that we are going to overlook something. So let's imagine instead how they are similar. So we could have a kind of conceptual exercise and say that, okay, whenever you recommend something, you are always by definition not recommending something else. So in some ways you are both bringing up and bringing down by definition. Taina Bucher has pointed out that, from a content creator's perspective, the the work of being on these platforms is all about visibility, attaining visibility, right? And that's about being ranked highly and shown to enough people and trending and being distributed, going viral. And for those who don't gain visibility, while their content is still on the platform, the experience is that they are basically relegated to being invisible, right? So there's a real cost to not being recommended. And we can make a similar point about moderation. So if there are things you remove from the site, then everything else has been sort of approved, right, validated. So in that way, moderation and recommendation are kind of, the flip of each other, the flip of the coin. But let me ask a different question, which is, where do they overlap? Where can recommendation be used as moderation? And what I found, this is what I want to talk about for the rest of the talk, is that most of the major platforms have quietly introduced policies where for content that isn't quite bad enough to remove, but they wish there was less of on the site, they will reduce the visibility of that content. We use a bunch of terms for that. So demotion, shadow banning, throttling, different techniques for keeping the content on the archive, showing it to some people, but not giving it amplification, giving it greater circulation through tools like recommendation, right? And most of the platforms have been relatively quiet about this. I'll talk about Facebook and YouTube that have been the most upfront, although putting 2 corporate blog posts about it isn't exactly about making that a clear and important element of what you're doing. Most platforms have been much more quiet about it. They hint at the fact that they do these things. And one of the things it does is it leaves users who are affected by these policies at a loss to be able to know what's happening to their content, to document things that are happening to their content, and to hold platforms accountable. So let's, for the rest of it, look at these techniques that I'll call reduction techniques, because there's a bunch of different terms for it. See how it kind of complicates, if we include it in content moderation, how it complicates how we think about what platforms do and don't do. And then also think a little bit about how these things get managed to be treated as separate, right? Instead of being treated as 2 parts of the same project. Okay, so I'll just give you an example. This was from July of 2021. US President Biden had made a statement about criticizing Facebook for not doing enough about disinformation regarding COVID vaccines and their effectiveness. And he said a phrase, "Facebook's killing people," which was a pretty strongly worded statement. And Facebook responded with a pretty sort of pointed post saying that they were doing a lot of work about COVID vaccine misinformation. And this phrase here where they said, when we see misinformation about COVID-19 vaccines, we take action against it. Since the beginning of the pandemic, we've removed over 18 million instances of COVID-19 misinformation. We've also labeled and reduced the visibility of more than 167 million pieces of COVID-19 content debunked by our fact-checking partners, so that fewer people see it. And it's interesting to me because in this kind of very matter-of-fact sentence, we have 2 tactics that are happening. One is removal, 18 million instances, and one is reduction, 167 million. This is just one example, but it's an example where we are reminded that reduction is not just a piece of what they're doing, it's actually the bigger piece of what they're doing, at least in this instance, right? This stands out to me as an example where most of the time, like I said, we think about content moderation being removal, right? Getting rid of bad content, getting rid of bad users. And the questions that remain are like, well, who decides who's bad according to what criteria? What are you taking down that you shouldn't, et cetera, et cetera. But content moderation has an immense array of techniques, removal just being one of them. So platforms will create age barriers, right? So content that only adults can see. Geo-blocking, so that only certain regions, users in certain regions can see. Safe search mechanisms that you can toggle on and off so that the search results return a filtered content or an unfiltered content. Warning labels, fact-checking labels, other kind of labels about possibly offensive content, interstitials, meaning before the content shows up, a sort of pop-up that you have to click through so you don't see it until you know what you're seeing. Prompts and nudges and reminders. So platforms have been playing with the idea of if they can assess that your comment might be harassing, it'll give you a reminder before you post it. Are you sure that you want to post this? And let the person edit it. Hashtag blocking, so not returning search results for certain terms that they know are going to produce pornographic content or conspiracy content. Techniques like strikes rules. So for a content creator that violates the rules, maybe you say after 3 times, you're then going to have a day-long suspension. So these kind of systems of punishment. Temporary holds that will hold a piece of content for a time, will suspend a user for 6 hours or a day or a week. And then also demonetization. So if they're paying users, maybe ad revenue or something based on clicks, they can take away the offer of finance. So really, when we get sort of overly focused on, oh my God, Twitter has kicked off so-and-so, we lose sight of this quite rich array of techniques that platforms are using. So reduction techniques. In January 2019, YouTube announced a kind of renaming of their new content moderation policy. They called it the 4 R's of responsibility: remove, raise, reward, and reduce. Remove is taking content down. Raise is choosing good content and boosting it. So like content that counters hate speech, having that delivered when a search might lead to hate speech. Reward, meaning who do you pay revenue to? And then reduce. And in this post, they talked about reduction being how you handle content that comes close to, but doesn't quite cross the line of violating the community guidelines. They have 2 categories that they describe in here. One is harmful misinformation. This is in response to the kind of concerns about misinformation in 2016, 2017, 2018. And a category they call borderline content, which if you imagine kind of spatially is just, if you draw a line, then anything that kind of approaches that line. So really any category of content that they have a rule about, they can now treat borderline content as something to be reduced. In the post, they assure us that reducing means taking things out of recommendation, but that the content still is available. So the video is in the archive, you can find it by direct links, or maybe you're subscribed to that user. But in your recommendation column, in those videos sliding along the side, this video will not show up or be less likely to show up. They were already doing this policy for a couple months when they announced this. So this started in 2018. In 2018, also, Facebook made a similar statement using the same phrase, borderline content. I've yet been able to identify whether those terms came from the same place or that was just separate invention. This document that was posted by Mark Zuckerberg, this blueprint for a similar kind of reformulation of their policies, describes this reduction technique, saying the most effective way to stop the spread of misinformation is to remove the fake accounts that generate it. The next most effective strategy is reducing its distribution and virality. For Facebook, there are 3 categories. There's one that is misinformation, so matching YouTube. The second is borderline content, also matching YouTube. And then the third is what they call low quality content. And you can see in both of these statements, there's a lineage being drawn, a link. Notice that YouTube says, continuing our work to improve recommendations. They link it back to getting rid of clickbait, getting rid of repeat content, so you don't get the same video a bunch of times. Content that was automatically generated by these kind of content farms that make really low quality videos in response to news trends. So the interventions being framed as partially this kind of work on improving recommendations, right? The kind of like, our recommendations will be higher quality because we will adjust our algorithm, but also in response to kind of classic moderation concerns, misinformation, conspiracy, harassment, hate speech, the kind of classics. So it's a very interesting blend of thinking about recommendation as a tool of moderation, but also thinking about it as an improvement of quality. And I think that overlap between quality thoughts and harm thoughts are really interesting here. Facebook and YouTube have been the most obvious and the most upfront about this, but I think we can see this in other platforms, especially if we kind of expand the definition a little bit. So Twitter has said in blog posts, usually specific ones about election content, vaccination content, that they will reduce the visibility of content for those reasons. So they have acknowledged that they reduce visibility as well. LinkedIn and TikTok have both referenced in their policies that they limit the visibility of certain content. That's about as far as they go at saying under what conditions they do this. Instagram introduced the same policy as Facebook did, so they would limit what they recommended. They also introduced this thing in 2021 called sensitive content control. It's a little different because what they're saying is that each user can choose whether their recommendation page, their sort of For You page, is going to be filtered or not in terms of the sort of range of content that's going to show up there. What's interesting is that when they explain how it would work, they said you could have no filter, you could have some filter, parentheses, default, and then more filtering. So it was a reminder that like the default position was already being filtered, right? So you can dial that sort of up or down, but Instagram was already filtering those recommendations for sensitive content, right? Without specifying too much of what they mean. Tumblr, I don't have it up there on the screen, but Tumblr for several years, especially because they used to have a very permissive approach to sexual content, they would do hashtag blocking. So you might find pornographic content, but if you typed in porn as a search, you would get nothing. And similarly, that is to me this kind of distinction between it's in the archive, it's there, but the mechanisms the platform uses to deliver content are going to keep it out, right? So it's a similar gesture. Reddit has a policy that they call quarantining, and again, if we kind of step back and see the similarities, I think it's quite similar. So Reddit will, if they have a subreddit, so a whole community that is engaged in increasingly problematic content, they will quarantine that group. What that means is that if you try to go there, there'll be kind of a warning page. You have to click through to go. Those groups can't earn money in any of their sort of revenue sharing mechanisms, but this is the place where, to me, it looks like reduction. Any post on that group, no matter how popular it gets, will never show up on the front page, right? So if you're looking at the front page of Reddit, which you might think of as a recommendation vehicle, that content will simply not show up, and it will not be visible that it doesn't show up, right? There's no way to know what has not been delivered in a recommendation system. And then finally, Spotify did a really interesting thing. They had to back off of this because they got criticized, but they tried to do this thing where they said certain artists, their example was R. Kelly, who have engaged in problematic behavior off the platform, right? Criminal behavior off the platform, they would take them off of the Spotify playlists. Now, this is a subtle distinction being made. So R. Kelly's music would stay in Spotify. If you looked up the artist, you would find him. They would even be possible to be on users' playlists. So if I made a playlist and put an R. Kelly song on there, it would go on there. But Spotify's playlists, so quite well-known ones like Rap Caviar, which have real financial consequences for new artists, give a great deal of visibility to people who make it on that playlist, they would pull those artists from there. And again, their argument was saying, we want to make this distinction between the music that deserves to be in the archive, which is sort of everything, although Spotify does engage in content moderation, different from the playlist, which is a kind of like, they recognize the power that they have in sort of when you add something to a playlist, you've given it visibility, possible financial gain, legitimacy, and they wanted to take these specific artists out of that. They got pushback because it seemed like a very ad hoc policy. Why those two artists and not a bunch of others who have engaged in, criminal behavior in the past? Why not Johnny Cash or John Lennon, right, who had run into legal trouble but weren't, currently upsetting people like R. Kelly was? So they pulled back from that policy. But a similar kind of reduction logic about it's still there, but it's not going to be delivered through these mechanisms. This I find really interesting because we have the distinction that's being made between moderation and recommendation. but in some ways that I think there's an overlap, increasingly an overlap. But there's another kind of distinction that this depends on. And it's this distinction between the archive and the amplification, right? So YouTube saying the video will be there, but it's questionable enough, it's risky enough that we won't put it in our recommendation system. Spotify drawing this line between what's in the catalog, what's in a user's playlist, what's in the company's playlist. This distinction is kind of imagining that the platform's not one thing, but they are components, different components, right? And it can get quite sophisticated. So we could think about YouTube and say what YouTube is doing is saying that in fact, there are different zones of responsibility. So what video you're watching, what videos you subscribe to, whether you read the comments is one kind of idea about responsibility. And then that column on the right, which is produced by YouTube's recommendation algorithm, of course, taking into account your practices, what videos you watched in all the ways that we know, that's a different zone of responsibility, right? So even though your encounter with YouTube looks like this and you get all of it, YouTube is trying to separate and make this kind of like responsibility terrain where like this part is different than this part and should be understood as different. Facebook makes a really interesting distinction where they talk about the difference between connected content and unconnected content. And this requires understanding Facebook's kind of thinking. What they mean is they've created this social graph, what they call the social graph of what content is sort of nearest to you based on what they know. So if Anna and I are friends on Facebook, then Anna's post is likely going to show up on my newsfeed. That's going to depend on how recent and how many interactions we've had. But that's connected content because I put it in the social graph. When I friended Anna, it was implicitly me saying, I want whatever Anna says. So if Anna says something offensive, the responsibility is on me for having drawn that connection that Facebook simply recognized by our friending or our liking or our responding to each other. If Facebook recommends a group that says, oh, based on your activity, you might like this group or this page or this company, that's unconnected. It wasn't based on past actions by the user. Now, these distinctions are really subtle because it is based on their read of my taste based on practices, but I didn't take an action that connected those things on my behalf. So then they say, we have a different responsibility for the unconnected, right? Because we recommended the page rather than being a product of you having friended someone in the past. Again, it's a messy distinction that they're treating as clean, but it's an important one. And we see this in other places, so not just social media. For instance, when Google talks about whether they should deliver up results to dangerous sites, illegal sites, harassing sites, they will often say, look, it's an index. It's on the web. Our job is to index the web. We should not be in the business of saying this link is not good and this link is not healthy and this link is toxic. But when they autocomplete your search results, they are much more comfortable and much more urgent to not autocomplete that phrase, right, with something offensive. That's a really subtle distinction, but in some ways it's like, that's their recommendation system. You started typing, they said, did you mean this? Do you want to search this? And of course it has real results because some people click on that search, even if it wasn't what they were thinking of searching for. So in this little distinction between this column of results and this, little column of suggested search queries is a different landscape of responsibility that Google is trying to set up, or YouTube is trying to set up, or Facebook is trying to set up. These distinctions are messy. They also change over time. So we don't want to treat them as obvious. But at a moment, the platforms would like to treat them as obvious because, of course, the middle of that page is different than the right side of that page. Okay, I want to say a little bit about how these reductions are done. I don't want to spend too much time on this. I can come back to it later. But many of you will probably guess this when platforms decide that they want to reduce the visibility of some content that is risky, harmful, misleading enough, but not enough to remove it. What do? Well, not surprisingly, they get a bunch of humans to rate stuff, and then they try to develop a machine learning classifier that will predict those ratings and do it automatically. Interestingly, Facebook and YouTube took a slightly different strategy. So Facebook uses the same algorithms that are already in place to try to find content they will remove, and then just says if it got a lower score on that rating, right? It's not so high as to be reviewed for removal, but maybe it's close, then maybe it's worth reducing. YouTube designed a separate classifier. They were worried about misinformation and conspiracy content. They designed a separate classifier that they trained separately to spot borderline content. And they say it works very well. What this means is that, okay, and then there are two ways that the platform can intervene. And what I've got here is a graphic from a YouTube academic publication about how their search engine works, their recommendation engine works. And there are 2 points at which they gather up videos that they might recommend to you. The first is what it's called candidate generation. They don't rank millions of videos to decide what to show you next. What they do is they grab several hundred that are judged relevant on a very sort of quick basis. And then this is the next step. They rank those 200 or 300 so that decides what video is first, what video is second, what video is third. That means that a video that has been flagged by this classifier that says this is, you know, conspiracy content that is probably borderline, there are 2 places that YouTube could remove it from possible distribution. One is candidate generation. So if you say any video that gets this flag doesn't go into candidate generation, no one will see it in the recommendation home. It will never be served up. But the second possibility, there we go. Let me know if you're still seeing my slides. They kind of went off. Good, thanks. The other possibility is that you can include them in candidate generation, but then kind of like weight them differently. So in the same way that a video might be weighed highly because it's very new, or weighed highly because lots of people have liked it, you could weigh it lower because it has received this flag. So it could be recommended, but it is less likely to be recommended. It could be much lower on the list, so you could scroll down and find it, or it's only likely to be recommended to some people based on what they searched for. And those are 2 very different ways. So a kind of do not recommend ever, or a do not recommend as often. The other thing to remember is that they could then do that for all users across the entire site, or they could do it for some users, and that could be by region, by age, by time of day, by search query, by past interests, like whatever sort of way they could distinguish that they want to. All right, I'm going to do this last thing very quickly, this second to last thing very quickly, because I want to make sure we have time for discussion. But it's worth thinking about. Let me see, there we go. Why platforms do this? Because if this content is questionable, they could also just change the rule and say this is removable too. So why create this separate category of things that should be reduced but not removed? There are a couple answers. So Facebook has this weird answer that you see in these graphs that look mathematical but are not, where they argue that no matter where you draw a line, there's going to be this interest in the racy, in the salacious, in the risky. And so even if you shift the line, you're still going to get like demand that lives in this borderline area. And what they suggest they should do is the second map, which is not only should that line of activity and interest be flat, but it should actually curve down. Right? It's a very patronizing, paternalistic idea about what you shouldn't get, even though it's allowed and even though you want it. But that's their idea, is that, or at least that's what they say, that no matter where the line is drawn, there'll be this interest. YouTube has a different take, which is that their responsibility has changed. This obviously puts it in a very nice light, but they argue that for a long time, the recommendation column was not the primary way people got videos. They primarily got them linked to them, embedded in web pages, subscribed. That shifted, so now most people are getting their videos from the recommendation. They said 70% of videos watched are because they showed up in the recommendation column. So their argument is that that is an additional responsibility. And this is kind of an argument about amplification, right? That YouTube is causing things to be visible by recommending them. So therefore they have a responsibility for not recommending them. And then we can also doubt these reasons and say these techniques let platforms remove what they need to without having to write a new rule, respond to things that are changing really quickly, and enjoy the benefits of content without being charged with having amplified it, right? All of this comes out of a kind of growing critique that really, I think, formulated in 2018, at least in the public attention, which was that platforms don't just host problematic content, but that their tools may be amplifying that. Part of this argument was a response to the concerns about election information and misinformation in 2016 and after. Part of it is about people gaming the system, so producing content quickly that then is rewarded by recommendation because of its speed, even though it's false or dangerous or misleading. So in some ways, we can think of this as like, as the kind of conversation about platforms has been increasingly willing to hold them responsible for amplifying, not just hosting, but the platforms have begun to distinguish those two and say we have certain moderation techniques for what we host and what we shouldn't host, and another complementary set of techniques for what we recommend and should not recommend. Okay, there are a couple key questions that I think I want to leave this with. One is sort of an obvious one, which is those who are concerned about the power to moderate, wherever you fall on what platforms should do or who they should remove or not remove, what responsibility they have. One of the strong calls has been for platforms to be more transparent about what they take down and why they take it down and what kind of process they go through. If you remove a video or delete a tweet, it is better if you make clear that you've done so, right? So you leave a record, the video is not there, it says this has been removed. There's been increasingly calls like the Santa Clara principles to say platforms should report how much they take down, where requests come from, how accurate they're being about identifying certain kinds of content. There's also been calls, and some of the platforms have responded, that users should have a dashboard for their own content and know which things have been taken down. People who complain about content should know whether that complaint was answered or not. So what do you do with reduction? Because removal leaves a trace. There is evidence where the content was, that it's gone. There is a way to tell the user this post has been taken down. What do you do with reduction when the content is still there? It is circulating to some degree, but it is circulating less than it would have otherwise. The problem is that it's not clear what you should measure that against, right? So there is no normal calculation for how far any given post or video or comment should travel. That varies based on how the platform weighed things, who saw it early, whether it gathered likes, what it's competing against, what happened that day. And so the end reach of your video or your post has a number of factors, some of which are under the platform's control, some of which are not, but that are not stable in and of themselves. So if the platform has also then said, your video was deemed questionable, it should be not recommended at all or not recommended as much. And all users know is that they seem to have gotten less interest, right? Their video got fewer likes, or it got retweeted less, or they usually get a lot of comments and they only got a few. It's very difficult for the platform. It's not clear how platforms should report on the fact that they've done this. And what it does is it leaves users uncertain and suspicious about what's happened to their content, why it's happened to their content, to what degree it's happened to their content. And so we have this accountability problem where platforms are not being particularly transparent about this, calling it an adjustment to recommendation rather than a moderation technique, and really do have a problem with how you would possibly report this in a way that users could make use of. So what we might find is that, or what we do find is that some communities of users, like LGBTQ activists, sex workers, are trying to document that their content is being reduced. But the best they can do is they can find anecdotal evidence, right? I'm pretty sure my video came down. I'm pretty sure this post got slowed. And we're left with this very kind of problematic scenario where the platforms will say at certain moments, like in that response to Biden's critique, we're reducing the visibility of dangerous content. Users will say, I can't prove that my content was removed or was reduced, but I think it was. And then platforms will say, we don't do that, right? We don't shadow ban. They can disparage the critique, even in other moments when they say quite proudly that they're doing these things. That's a problem. And if the platforms are increasingly going to reduce in order to moderate, then we need to think about what accountability looks like in that context. I think there's sort of broader set of takeaways. This is where I want to end. One is that these techniques are content moderation by other means. So when we think of them as not content moderation, that's either because we've gotten too focused on removal and or the platforms obscure these techniques as being something else, right? Recommendation quality, ad hoc, don't talk about it all, any of those things. We need to remember that content moderation involves a lot of techniques and a lot of things that we might call design or we might call quality control, but that have moderating effects, right? That will moderate in the sense that taking something down will also as well, right? We need to think about how platforms intervene, right? And the platforms intervene in the circulation of information, the circulation of culture, the circulation of political expression by removing, reducing, personalizing, categorizing, rewarding, elevating, and that these strategies are overlapping and cumulative, both in practice and in effect, but they get separated, right? Discursively and institutionally and in practice, right? We make a mistake by thinking about platforms as archives, right? Places where content lives, because we do need to think quite critically about the amplification argument that the design of the system is having effect on circulation. And then the next step, which is, do we imagine if platforms adjust circulation for their own reasons, for public reasons, for a mix of the two, what do we do with that? One way to look at reduction is to say, this is maybe the most sophisticated thing platforms have ever done, right? It recognizes that you can't always just handle charged, harmful content by either keeping it or removing it. So this is in some ways a sophisticated answer, but it's also maybe the most dangerous because of its accountability, because it's so woven into the design of the platform. And in some ways, it also means that as we treat this as an adjustment to the algorithm, what we do is we normalize how content circulates otherwise, right? That the criteria that are used other than this are the normal ones, and then this is an adjustment. But how do we ask questions about the entirety of the system and its implications, while also recognizing that the platforms have an interest in highlighting what they do, obscuring other aspects, defining some things as together, and defining other things as apart, right? I think we will find ourselves asking questions about that public fora always need to exclude and amplify and curate and reduce. We're still enamored by this idea that the platform should be open except for something, except for trolls, except for harassers, except for pornography. But that as we reckon with this idea that platforms have always had the power to amplify some things and limit others, whether they're doing it for moderation techniques or just for your entertainment or quality or some measure, that we need to think about who ends up losing in this definition of what it means to intervene, right? This particular idea about what intervention is, what counts as moderation, what counts as reduction, what the algorithm is supposed to do, what should go viral. All of those have an idea about what is high quality, what is dangerous, what is valued, what is problematic. And that to me is the real moderation question. Not just do you kick off somebody or do you not, but also how are these platforms by all of their efforts shaping what we see and how are their efforts themselves being narrated so that we understand them in a particular way.